Brilliant. How's it going today, mate? You all right?
Yeah, good. How about yourself?
Yeah, good. I'm really excited to get into this, actually.
Yeah,
This is a
definitely.
really
I think,
important subject. I think we need to sort of do more of this and talk about this sort of
yeah,
stuff.
100%. So I think the main discussion for us today is the challenges, both from a client's perspective and advisor's perspective, in obtaining and holistic financial advice. And we're looking at it from two, fairly different perspectives. For yourself, it's from a mortgage and protection space, and for us, it's from a pensions and investments and inheritance tax space. So I think it would be nice for us to give both perspectives from there. So I think over to you, Matt. Really, what your thoughts are from your. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's put a really interesting point, Abs. And I think from my point of view, there's always been this thing. I was chatting to someone on LinkedIn last night, actually. It was quite funny because she put this post in there, and it was about how she was chatting to a couple that she knew, had been to see a mortgage advisor, and the mortgage advisor had obviously gone through the motions of getting them the mortgage. And this client basically was having a chat to him going, yeah, well, I didn't even know I needed insurances because the advisor never kind of signposted the importance of it. And I think it just goes back to this whole point of holistic advice, right? Holistic advice is more than just what you do, or it's more than what you can just offer. So it's a bit like when you think about, I'll be chatting to a client about mortgages or protection, for example, but there's a wider thing to think about here, which is, well, have you thought about estate planning? Have you thought about retirement planning? And I know obviously that's probably more your area of specialty, but the fact that I need to keep my mind open to the client's needs in the area and how that then might relate back to what I'm doing is a bit of a challenge, because I believe that one of the hardest things that we've got to overcome in the industry is that advisors have got to try and think beyond what they're talking about, beyond the initial inquiry, or beyond the scope of what they do, and how they can work alongside other people, for example, whether it be a firm like yours or another one, where they can then partner with someone who can offer a full suite of services to make sure that client receives the most holistic advice they can. I mean, it's a bit of a strange one, obviously, because clients tend to come to us for a very limited bandwidth of sort of services, right? So we tend to do mortgages, protection insurances, life insurance, income protection, critical illness, health insurance. And that's kind of like the scope of what we do. So we don't really get involved in financial planning side because it's not an area where we've got either the qualifications, the competence, the skill, or the knowledge to even go into. But what we have done is, I know we've spoken in the past, and you've sort of given me a few pointers and ideas as to how we can begin those conversations with people, even if it's something that we're not going to help them with, but just to signpost, have you looked into this? Have you spoke to someone about it? Would you like me to pass you on to someone? Because I think that's where we as advisors can really make the difference. And I think if we don't do it, I'm not necessarily sure the client's going to. And I always worry, and I'm sure you'll chip in a bit and say yours, I always worry that where we keep our focus on that very narrow bit of what it is we do, we may be doing the client a bit of a disservice by not thinking about the wider things. I mean, what's it like in your space? Because obviously I know you do a variety of things, but from your point of view, how does that fit in with your advice process?
I think I'd completely agree. I think it's a combination of advisors initially sticking to, rightly so, the areas that they specialize in and the areas that they have the knowledge in. But where advisors may let themselves and ultimately the client down is that you don't open up the conversation for other areas. Even if you can't offer that advice, it's still important that the client identifies areas of need in other aspects of their finances. So I think first and foremost, it's maybe the conversation that isn't opened up by the advisor. They're fairly focused on what the client has come to them with initially, which of course is important to address that. But also B, I think you tend to stick to the area you're confident and competent in, as you said, and don't really tend to open up to discuss other areas, which from my perspective, I believe is a disservice to the client, because they may come to you for mortgage advice, but if you haven't identified other areas that ultimately, as you know, as a mortgage advisor, it's beyond just the mortgage that can impact the mortgage. Funnily enough, if you haven't protected the mortgage, you can't pay it. If you have not looked after the money that you have in the bank and looked at ways of growing that, then the amount that you've got, a remortgage that could potentially help part of that mortgage isn't there. So I think I'd say that the first part of it is the conversation isn't opened, either for a lack of potentially confidence in talking about that area, but also maybe a lack of willingness, because that advisor can't advise on those products and it's not really an incentive for them to do so. But I don't think that from our perspective as advisor, I don't think that's good enough for us to just not do something or have the conversation because we can't advise on it. I think we need to look at our clients' needs as a whole and identify what we can do for them, and also direct them to maybe other people that can do the rest for them. I think the other side of it as well, Matt, is maybe from the client's perspective, when they go to speak to a mortgage advisor, whether they had other needs they were aware of or not, they don't tend to raise those because they believe I'm coming to speak to this person about mortgages, which once again feeds back to the advisor's responsibility of saying, although I specialize in this area of advice, that doesn't mean we shouldn't speak about everything as a whole. And then I can sort of direct you to speak to someone who specializes in that, just to make sure we're doing you the best sort of service all round and making sure you're looked after in every area. That's
a really good point. I also think there's a bit of a disparity as well in the client's minds between information and advice. So maybe, for example, a client comes to me because they want advice on a mortgage, but they may have a question about pension. They might not be looking to actually act, for example. And I've said, I mean, from my point of view, I've always said that I reckon that's the biggest problem we've got in our industry. You've got clients sat up there, and they probably have maybe just very basic questions. They just want some information or some knowledge. And I think probably in their mind, it doesn't warrant going to an office and sitting in front of a financial advisor or a pension advisor or a mortgage advisor, having that conversation. It may just be a simple question. And rather than scouring the internet, it's like maybe they sit there in this kind of void where they're not really being catered to. There's no one really there to provide advice, because essentially I think there's this disconnect. It's like, well, if I need advice, I'll go and sit with someone who talks about it, and they're going to sell me a product, or I'm going to buy a product, and that's how I get my advice. And I think maybe that's where there's a bit of an issue, that there's this sort of, there's probably more of a need to provide information, just basic information, just general stuff that people don't have easy or readily access to, other than things like money advice service and sites like that. But where we could help clients to kind of understand more about what they do, so that when they do, or they are ready to get the advice, they know what to do and speak to.
That's a very good point. I completely agree with that. And I think it's more a case of the attitude, maybe not in the industry, but so much for some advisors, understandably. But I think our attitude should be that we have an individual in front of us that has a variety of different needs, some that they're aware of and some that they're not. That's why they've come to a professional. And I think it's having that mindset of, I may not be able to help you in this particular area, and at the very least, I've identified that this is something you need more information on. And as advisors, it's our duty to provide this information, even if we're not able to provide advice. And sometimes it's just a very simple, question that we can answer, even though it doesn't lead to advice. Rightfully, like you said, you have some clients that will ask you questions about, should I be a limited company or should I be a sole trader? That's not our area of advice. That's, better sat for an accountant. However, that's just information that we should, as financial advisors, know and be able to repeat back to a client and say, this is the facts of a limited company, these are the facts of a sole trader. And if that is enough information for the client, then great. If not, then we can say, look, this is who you need to speak to. And I think it's collaborating with other professionals, which, now is a better time than any to be able to have a network of professionals that can work together to provide the client with an all-rounded, holistic view on their finances and their needs.
That's a really good shout, mate. And I think touching on a really important point there, by the way, because I've said this all along. Right? I think there's this bit in advice. It's a bit like when you look at social media, people doing posts and articles and stuff. I think in the advice community, we've always been a bit reticent about giving information or advice online, right? In areas where maybe we don't feel quite as confident, because perhaps, we're worried about saying the wrong thing. It's a bit like you look at some of the social media posts. I think lots of people hold back and they're very sort of like nervous and reticent to say anything for fear of saying the wrong thing. But I think we need probably to have this very clear distinction between advice, which is based on a fact-finding process where you dig into details and you provide advice based on a specific set of product or criteria to meet the client's needs and objectives that you've identified, versus giving information. And I think as long as we caveat that, I don't see what the risk is, because we're not saying, like you mentioned, that we're not specialists in tax advice or corporate structure, but, here's the pros and cons of each, maybe go and seek some separate advice, but here's a bit of information I'm happy to give you, because it is essentially information, not advice. And I think maybe if advisors got more confident with that separation of the two, you might find that we could be a bit more open about our conversations with our clients and ultimately deliver better value for them.
I completely agree. And I think if you look at most advice processes, whether it's from a financial advisor's perspective, a mortgage broker's perspective, even a protection advisor's perspective, within the advice and the fact-finding process, you capture this information a lot of the time anyway.
Sure.
So it's natural then to have a conversation at that point and say, right, we're looking at setting you up with an income protection policy. We need to know when you're retiring to be able to set how long the policy runs for. Here is where you'd have the natural conversation. So I think that probably brings us on to the next section, which is, what do you think the solutions for providing this sort of gap in holistic financial planning? If I had to ask you 3 solutions that you would go away and really implement, what would they be? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I think
no, it's fine. It's all about. That's what it's all about. You put me on the spot, a big spotlight. No, it's good. I think from my point of view, it's a case of I've heard this before. I remember Settle Meta from Openwork saying this at one of the events. I thought it was really good. I liked it, and he used the expression "write it or refer it," and that was obviously specifically about protection. But there's some merit in that generally across the whole spectrum of products and services, right? And I think it's a case of we really need to find people we can work with, who you can rely on. And I know that's probably easier said than done, because you've then got to find people you can trust, who you think are going to provide the same level of service and care to your clients as you maybe would within your own business. But I think it's really important to partner with people who can provide the things that you can't. And I've always been a fan and an advocate of advisors being specialists in something. Because it's a bit like when I tried to do both mortgage and protection, I realised there was so much criteria to learn across all of it that actually I thought, you know what, I'd rather have a specialism in protection. That's not to say it's wrong, by the way, you can't do it, but I think that's one thing I do. I'd say pick your area of expertise, become a master of your craft, learn it very, very well, and then partner with other people that can deliver the services that you either choose not to or would prefer someone else to do. So having that, I also believe it's important to have like a buddy system for people outside the business. So I've got protection colleagues that I work with that aren't part of my own business. And what I do is I work with them routinely just to sort of check on trends and changes to keep my knowledge abreast, and also share ideas and best practices, because I believe that's a really important point about it. If you want to deliver holistic advice, you've got to be at the top of your game. You've got to remain knowledgeable of what's going on in the marketplace, and working with other advisors outside of your business means that you keep honest, because you're not falling into negative processes. You're always keeping that holistic, open mindset. And then the third thing I'd say is, don't be afraid to talk about things you're not that confident in, because like I said to you, if you're just giving information, you're not giving advice, but signposting the importance of going to speak to someone else who does specialise in that. Even if it's someone you don't know, even if you literally send them away and say, well, look, go to the Bieber website, go over here, go wherever, just find someone who can do this for you, because I think it's important you speak to someone. I'll try and find someone, but you're welcome to go and find your own. I think signposting is very important, because I think that demonstrates a clear and present commitment to deliver that holistic advice to your client, to make sure they have everything they need. And even if it's not something you can do, just at least signpost to someone who can. Those are my 3. What about yourself? What are your thoughts?
Very good. I think I'd that pretty much covers it from an advice perspective. I think as advisors, we know what we need to do, and just do it and get better at it, and have these conversations that we can sort of bounce off each other and really help each other to provide the best service for clients. I think the other side of it is more from the client's perspective. I think for clients to just be more open when you speak to a professional about one aspect of your finances, that clients should have the confidence to be able to say whether they believe the person in front of them can help them or not. They should be able to talk about their finances as a whole. And I think if an advisor speaks to you and says, as a client, I'm a mortgage advisor, however, any other element of your finances, I can either direct someone or at least help, then I think that then gives the client an opportunity to be open-minded. That's all really an advisor needs, as a client, to be more open-minded about discussing all aspects of their finances. At the end of the day, they're sat in front of a professional who really can guide them in any area of their finances, and they just need to trust that the information they provide will be useful to them ultimately. So I think it's the duty and the responsibility of the advisor in the majority, but also from a client's perspective, sort of being more open with an advisor when they try and open up other areas. Because traditionally, I think most people are wary that someone is trying to sell them something additional to what they're already looking for, which I understand, and in some industries that is the case. But when it comes down to financial advice, it's more a case of the advisor making sure that not many people get the opportunity to be sat in front of a professional to talk about their finances. So I think an advisor wants to make sure that when that person's sat in front of them, they then have the opportunity to look into their finances as a whole, whether that be with them or with someone else. I think it's a very important milestone, because, we don't always review our finances as a whole regularly. So when you're sat in front of one person about one thing, might be a mortgage or protection, that is then an opportunity for both the advisor to help the client, but also the client to then identify areas across their finances. So I think it's a piece from both the advisor and the client.
Yeah, that's a really valid point. And I guess the advice you give the client is just say, look, don't be afraid to ask the question. I think that maybe is one of the biggest barriers to advice, is that clients often feel that maybe they can't ask the question, or maybe, it's almost like this preconception that I, in fact, had a call this morning. So I spoke to a client this morning and I was talking to them about income protection, and we've looked at some policies for them, and I kind of guided them through the process and what I was going to do and why. And it's a question of, oh, look, if we have to come back to you with more questions or anything, what's your fee? There's no fee. You're a customer of mine. I mean, don't get me wrong, I know that model might apply in certain things, obviously there's extra things to do. But I'm kind of trying to reiterate the point that, hold on a minute, we're doing this product, and it's not like this is a transactional thing where you effectively take this product out and then I leave you to it. This is a case of I'm your advisor now, and I have to consider the wider implications of what we're talking about. And I think it's a case of the client shouldn't be afraid to ask those sort of questions, because I don't think when it comes to finances there's such thing as a stupid question. I had someone once ask what's better to use, a credit card or a debit card, and I don't think that's a stupid question, because the hard thing is, as advisors, is that often we have privileged information, we have access to knowledge and information in financial sector that maybe your average consumer wouldn't readily have access to. And I think that often we forget that, and then when someone comes in front of us, this is some basic stuff to us, but actually it's quite complex and maybe not that commonplace and thing to talk about. And I mean, culturally, you must know this as well. I certainly know within my household, money wasn't the subject that we talked about much. It was, kept at the table. And I think that often drives this sort of reticence to discuss things, or maybe not voice your concerns or ask questions. So I think you're right, mate. I think it's a combination thing of coming at it from the advice point of view, in terms of us creating a platform where clients feel comfortable to talk about these things and raise these questions. But at the same time, consumers feeling that they have the capacity to ask the questions and feel that they're not going to be ridiculed or laughed at. They can ask anything they want to, because certainly from my point of view, I've had clients, I've discussed this offline, but clients have spoken to me about income protection. Like you said, we talk about retirement age, and that sparks a whole conversation around, well, part of the reason we're doing income protection is to make sure that your income carries on all the way through to retirement, so that you don't dip into your pension provisions, and that you can actually enjoy that kind of standard retirement if you want to, which then brings in the very obvious question, well, what are you doing with regards to your retirement planning? So I think there are logical connections between the various sort of channels of work that we all do. And I think that we owe it to our customers to make sure that we are always trying to think above and beyond what it is we do. And I naturally believe, I mean, again, you can correct me if you think this is wrong, but I naturally think that makes you far more competitive. Because I always fear that, like, if I don't do this right, then what's going to happen is my client, if they have, say, pension needs, they might go and speak to a different pension advisor that does all the same things that I do, and then I might lose the customer because I haven't been smart enough to consider their overall needs beyond what it is I do. So being able to provide a full suite of packages through strategic alliances with other advisors who specialise in that, I believe makes you more competitive, more likely to retain those customers as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it would be great to have some sort of platform where advisors can openly and honestly talk with each other about challenges and how we can help improve the industry, but also a platform where our clients can feed back to us and say, this is how they believe they would receive a better service, or how they have received a better service by the implements we've changed as a community of advisors. So I think we've discussed quite a lot there, and it'd be nice to see if any sort of clients or advisors have any further input, anything they'd like to say. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to work as a community to improve how we deliver our advice to our clients and create opportunities to collaborate in specialities. I think
that's a really important point, Abs. And I think half the problem we have maybe is that we view it from our own perspective. And that, when we talked about doing this, we even said it'd be great to put ourselves in the perspective of the client. I mean, obviously we deal with clients on a daily basis, and I try wherever possible to make things relatable. But there's a really value-added point there about what you're saying in terms of getting that feedback from the client, because we do things a certain way because we believe it's the right way to do it, but actually it might not be the best delivery mechanism for the client. So it's really good to get feedback from people. So, that worked really well. I liked it when you did that. Or, if you could put me in touch with someone, or all those kind of things you're talking about. Let me ask you a question then. What do you think the future of advice looks like? What do you think the future of holistic advice actually looks like? Because what we're talking about here is great in terms of conceptual stuff, but now how do you envisage that actually happening? What do you think the future holds?
That's a great question. I think, do you know what I think the future holds in general? And but to be more specific in terms of financial planning is just a more honest human interaction between client and advisor, where it's just more of a conversation. We are in a professional industry. It's a very regulated industry, and rightfully so. But I don't think that should scare us from being able just to talk as people to our clients and just talk in a more sort of relatable way. And a lot of, like you said, getting feedback from our clients. We, have lots and lots of reviews that our clients leave us across many platforms. And a lot of the time what they say is, my advisor was really easy to talk to. He made it very simple. He really understood what I wanted. So I think that just boils down to being afraid of just having an honest and open conversation, person to person. Yes, it's advisor to client. And yes, it's a professionally regulated industry. But at the same time, I think the way financial advice is moving is just having a sort of more relatable, more relaxed approach to the relationship between the advisor and the client. And ultimately, that helps build a longer term relationship. And I think that's another area where financial planning sometimes lets itself down, where things are implemented at the outset, but they're not followed up very regularly, and the client doesn't get the opportunity to ensure that initial plan you set in place for them can continue to be maintained. And I think that comes down to a relationship between a client and an advisor. And I think that's where I'm seeing the industry improve. And that's certainly where we want to improve and make sure that we just work with our clients and make things simple and easy for them. And we now have, great technology that helps us make those sorts of things easier. So I'm excited, I think, for the future of financial planning. I do think it's going to become a much more sought after and a much just better place all round for both clients and advisors.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's funny because if you ask me the same question, I'll probably give you exactly the same answer. I think from my perspective, but if you look at like the pandemic and the current situation, I think what's been really interesting about that is that it's certainly raised a lot of questions for many, many households about financial resilience, financial planning, insurances and things like that, and kind of being aware of their dependency on income and what it means in terms of both today and their future plans as well. So I think there's been this real sort of alarming wake-up call for many people. And I think what it's done is it's naturally made these conversations far more likely to happen with a lot of people, which is only a blessing, obviously not anything from anyone who's struggling financially. But I think the fact that more people are talking openly about it and that we've had this situation happen is only a good thing. And I completely agree with you that I think the whole market is shifting more to this idea of let's make it real, let's make it relatable, let's have very nice, pleasant conversations to break down what those traditional barriers, because I believe half the problem is this perception from the consumer client point of view that financial advice is like some guy in a stuffy office in a suit and a tie talking to you about things that you can't understand. And where we are going to add real value and build more trust and authority in what we do is essentially, from my point of view, the dissemination of information. It's taking what we know and the knowledge we've got and putting it in very simple terms. Your average consumer can feel like they've come out of that meeting better educated, better informed, and able to make the right decisions. And I think if we do that, we will drive more people to be having these comfortable conversations with advisors. Advisors will naturally feel less salesy and actually more like they're giving very pleasant advice. You do that, mate. I see the market. I'm very excited as well. I think if we do that, the market will only inevitably improve for everyone.
Look, I think finances, I completely agree with you on that, Matt, but I think finances can be a scary, stressful thing. But at the same time, if you're sat in front of the right advisor, it can very quickly go from, stressful, scary, overwhelming to liberating, exciting. And when you have your finances in order and you have a professional you can trust looking after them, and you have the right insurance in place to protect you and give you the peace of mind, then I think you can very quickly go from stress, to being liberated and confident.
You touched on a really good point I don't want to interrupt you, but you touched on a really good point. You used the word trust, right? And I really liked it when you used that word, because I guess for me that's pretty much indicative of what we're trying to achieve. You're trying to get that trusting relationship with your client. Right? So sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to ask you.
No, that's fine.
How do you feel that we as advisors can build greater trust with our customers?
I know it sounds cliche, but I'm a firm believer that actions do speak louder than words. And trust isn't me telling you what I can do for you. Trust isn't me telling you that I will look after you. Trust isn't me necessarily proving that I've done this for many other people. I think trust is saying that, is essentially building a relationship with your client where when they come to you for something, you give them the best possible service to achieve that, and they trust that you're good at doing that. But on top of that, I think trust is showing your client how, even without their input at all times, you will be managing their finances for them and being transparent with how you'll be doing it. And most importantly, educating the client on how you'll be doing it. So I think trust comes in the way that we look after and treat our clients, to educate, to really just provide the best possible service we can. And that in itself will build trust. That's my personal opinion of it.
I agree. Educate's really important for me, because it's like I said, it's that dissemination of information where I believe the biggest change happens, because when you're giving that client the information that they think is essentially very, what's the word I'm looking for? Like quite protected, if you like, and that it's like something that we've learned, that we've got qualifications to advise on. I think the fact that we disseminate that into simple terms for the client is where that trust is really built. But also, like you said, I mean, I have had a conversation recently where I've told a client, I've literally talked them out of taking something, because when I looked at their needs, I decided actually they didn't really need anything because they weren't in the situation. I think sometimes there's just as much merit in actually saying to the client, you know something, looking at your situation, there's not a lot I do differently, or the previous advisor that spoke to you did very well, or they did a proper job for you. You know, your insurances are in trust and you've got the cover you need, for example. And I think there's as much merit in that in terms of building trust, because the client's likely to come back to me at some point anyway, or refer their friends and family to me because I've built trust with them. Not for the sake of building trust, because it's the right thing to do anyway. Yeah. I think that logically is what only enhances and improves the industry for all, whether it be consumer, whether it be for advisor. But no, I completely agree.
Completely agree.